This is a test of the emergency broadcast system.
In 5, check for sound. 4,
It's showtime.
3,
Let's go.
1, launch.
You're listening to the Pro Audio Suite, a program for audio and voiceover professionals. On the panel, from LA, George Whittam, tech to the VO stars. From Sydney, Darren Robbo Robertson, audio engineer and producer at Voodoo Sound. From Chicago, Robert Marshall, from Someone Audio Post and co-founder of Source Elements. And finally, me, Andrew Peters, voiceover talent and founder of Real-Time Casting. And on today's show, our guest from London, voiceover talent and owner of CKUK, Christopher Kent. And here we are with a brand new podcast. This is called the Pro Audio Suite. And the lineup has changed, but I'm still here. But lots of things have been happening since we had our last show, which was just before Christmas. One particular thing was NAMM in Los Angeles. And I've got a funny feeling, George, you were there.
Oh, yes, I was. I was over there with my show VOBS and Voiceover Body Shop. And we were walking around for a couple of days. 2 days, we scoured the halls looking for things. Game changers is what we like to look for. And, you know, it takes a long time and a little bit of luck to find things that truly jump out as game changers, I have to admit. We were kind of focused on microphones and audio interfaces because that's the stuff that's most relevant to most voice actors. And, you know, it was really cool to see Neumann re-release the U67.
I saw that.
That was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to rely on your old vintage 67s that rotate in and out of the tech shop. I have one client that uses them, and he does rotate them in and out of service regularly.
I've paid people to take U87s and sort of do their own take on a 67, actually. Like busted up U87 and gut it and put in that EF86 tube.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought what was interesting was that we asked the fellow, you know, why tube? What is it about the tube? And the guy from Neumann specifically, and this is something that I believe anyway, is that the tube itself in the mic is very, very little to do with the actual sound tonal characteristic. It's actually more the transformer. And so I thought that was fascinating. But that mic does have a certain sound that's hard to replicate. Yeah, there's a Peluso P67 made here in the States that's pretty darn good, actually. We put one up against the U67, and my client that had the flaky 67s was happy. I don't know if he's ready to drop $7,000 US for a U67, but I think they based that price on the resale value of a used 67. I think that's how they came up with that price, because they do go for about that.
I saw one for sale in Australia, in Australian dollars, 21,000.
Whoa.
Yeah.
For a used U67, 21 grand.
They're only going up. I was going to say 6,000 sounds like a price from almost 10 years ago on a 67.
There you go. They're worth more than I thought.
Yeah.
So,
but there's a lot of copies. There's a lot of copies of that. I've got a Soundulux U99, which again uses that EF80, or I think it's EF86 tube. And there's and Blue, I believe, made one, and there's a lot of takes on it, you know, trying to recreate it, as well as the U87. So it's interesting, but it's really welcome.
Well, this one is supposed to be a part-for-part replication of the original. You can take any piece, swap it out with an old mic, and it's a direct replacement. That's what they say.
I wonder if they're using the new old stock EF86 tubes or valves.
Yeah. I really wonder, because another copy that I had made actually was by an Australian named Bee's Knees. And so he did a copy for me, and he put an EF86 in there. And I used it for a couple of years, but the build itself was a little bit shoddy, a little bit troublesome. And so he took it back and he kind of reinforced it and just sort of took it on himself. And he kind of switched the tube out with a tube that's more accessible. And it's the same tube, actually, I believe, that Peluso uses for his P67. And I got to say, it's still great. And I don't have enough of these to start comparing and telling that it's exactly the same, but that might kind of lend towards the theory that it's more in the transformer than it is in the tube itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because the mic I'm on now has the EF86 valve.
Which mic is that?
Inside.
Which mic?
That's
which mic
the Microtech Cafel M92.1S. So it's the M7 capsule, the EF86 tube.
Okay, so that's a bottle mic.
It's not a bottle. It's just it looks kind of like the old UM57, which was its granddad, I suppose.
Yes. Well, so Microtech and Neumann split, and they both took the same designs, but I believe that they split before because that was, with the war. The U67, I don't know, was it 1967? I'm not too sure.
No, 65, and that was the weird thing about it. Because they had the 47, which they developed in 47. And then they developed the 67 in 65, and they were going to call it the U65. And they went, no, well, why don't you call it the U67? Because you had the 47.
Wow, this could become the history of microphone show very fast.
Yeah.
Man, you guys are a wealth of knowledge. It's awesome.
Well, this is like one of the I mean, there's some other funny stuff going over to Motown. When the 87 came out, Motown dumped, or at least I've heard, or I read an article, they dumped all their tube mics and they went with the 87, which was basically a transistorized 67. And they were fine with it for a while, although, by the 90s, they were like, what did we do? We sold off.
And of course, the 87 came out in what, 70, was it 1971 or
71?
Something?
Yeah, because I've got some 87s, and they're not AIs, they're just the original 87s. They're a little bit noisier. And so, yeah.
Made in West Germany.
Funny thing, the original 87 could run off a battery. Who knew?
Ooh.
Wow.
Well, I'll tell you, in a totally different vein from NAMM, because, there was a lot to see, and this is at the other end of the spectrum. The company Art, they're kind of known for, pretty cheap tube stuff, right? Like little tube mic preamps, little tube this and tube that. They came out with a pair of studio monitors that were kind of fascinating. And I will not pass judgment whatsoever until I can somehow get a pair to demo, but they're called the RM5. And what made them cool is they're not very thick. So they can stand next to a flat screen monitor. I think they're only about 3 or 4 inches deep. And they fit up flat against a wall. They take up very little space. But what makes them interesting is they have on either side a very large, elliptically or oblong-shaped passive radiator. So each side of the speaker is a huge passive radiator. It's kind of hard to picture it because the speaker is more or less rectangular from the front, but it has a curved top and bottom. So from the side view, it's sort of an elongated rectangle with rounded ends, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And inside that are the radiators. So it's supposed to be bound to about 35 hertz for something that's very small that fits on fits on either side of a laptop screen or a desktop display. And those look pretty darn cool, I have to say. Very well thought out, interesting industrial design. So hoping to get my hands on those to demo one of these days.
Well, they might like to send us 4 pairs. Just to have a listen.
If you're listening, Art. They actually come up with a lot of kind of good stuff. Like I know that their valve or their tube mic preamp, I was reading an SOS article and they shot out blind with Neve copies and a whole range of mic preamps, everything from, $2,500 single channel mic preamps down to a Mackie 1202. And that single channel valve preamp that they had scored really high, and it's extremely affordable, but it's got all these really great features, impedance matching and all kinds of stuff. And they have other interesting boxes like little headphone USB, pretty small, nifty small boxes. They seem like a good company, actually.
I like that they make a lot of problem solvers. They make interesting little gadgets. And they have a little mixer now called the USB Mix 4 that if you just have a very basic studio, but you want that ability to do loop back, so you want to be able to take a playback and loop it back to Skype or something like that, their little USB Mix 4 has that ability. It has the loop back function. You just flick a switch. So for an $80 mixer, if it has a decent enough preamp, which might be for portable use, it could be a cool little gadget. So can't call them game changers, but these are things that stood out that looked really interesting to me during our 2 days at the show.
Well, the one I did see that I thought could be a game changer was the Flock digital, or it's not digital, analog/digital patch bay. Did you check that out?
No, I saw you sent me a picture of it, but I totally missed that at the show.
Yeah, that doesn't
mean anything. This show is huge, by the way. Yeah. It had a whole new hall that didn't even exist until this year. That's the size of 2 AES shows. And then you have the rest of the giant hall, which had even more So it was a lot to see. But that sounds really fascinating. What do you think the use case for you might be for something like that?
Well, shouldn't be for anyone like me, but you know what I'm like. I can't help myself. But the idea is that instead of having, patching, you can actually do it on the screen. So even though it's analog, it actually has like a USB out, USB out. So you can just pick, like everything's patched in. So you go, I'll have that microphone with that, and you just drag and drop. And then you set up the chain how you want.
It's kind of like the CM Automation had a 16 or 32 channel analog patching system, but you gotta make sure with those systems that they're, like, a lot of the times, especially if it has the capability to send one input to multiple outputs, there's some gain going on. There's some chips in there, and it's not completely entirely 1,000% passive, possibly.
Right. You mean talking about it's almost like a DA or distribution amplifier.
Exactly. Like that's the way a lot of like the facility routers, that handle a post house I worked at had a huge router, had an AES layer and serial digital layer for video, right. Analog audio. And it's a great feature. You're able to kind of send things multiple places at the same time, but it's definitely going through electronics.
Not a purest signal path, more than likely, is what you're saying.
Possibly, right. I don't know the product, but it depends on, and if not, it's like a servo switching or somehow mechanically making those switches. Not sure.
It's cool. I'm looking at a video of it now, and I think what makes it unique, like you said, it is the user interface. The user interface of it is very unique in that it's click and drag. So it doesn't make your head explode if you're not not an engineer that understands signal path. It's all laid out on the screen.
And it also does things for you, like if you forget that it's 48 phantom power, it will actually tell you and won't allow you to drop in, say, for instance, a tube mic. If you've got P48 selected, it won't select it for you. So you don't blow things up.
So it has preamps in it?
Yeah. Does it have preamps too?
No, everything that's in there goes through that patch bay.
Oh, I see. So the whole idea is that it's not a preamp, but any mic that requires a phantom power it will supply the phantom power for that particular mic.
Yeah, it will tell you if the phantom power's on or, it needs to be turned off.
So is it sensing the phantom power on the line? Is that what it's doing?
Yeah.
I see.
That's what I gather. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, I have that video up. I'm going to watch that later.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
I'm sitting here looking at my little analog patch bay thinking, you're going nowhere, baby.
Hell yeah, man. I put in a TT patch bay with these little tiny Molex. I don't know what bays you have. Do you have quarter inch or TT?
Yeah, TT.
Yeah. And so what's on the back of your TT? Is it 25 pin or you solder to it, or what's on the back?
Yeah, soldered in place, yeah.
So I went through the same thing, and there's some really sweet TT patch bays that you can actually use little jumpers and change each module to be half normaled, fully normaled, not normaled. And then on the back of it, they use these little Molex, Elco, right? And everyone thinks of Elco as being this huge block with, I forget how many points on it. Yeah. But Elco also made a little 3-pin system. And you can pull this TT patch bay out and redo the whole back of it, just like you're patching cables. So it's almost like the workflow of those really junky quarter-inch to quarter-inch patch bays. Yeah. With the solidness and the density of a TT bay. It's great.
Wow. Nice. I never got to use quality stuff like that. I was using the crappy quarter-inch in and out patch bays, which in a remote recording truck that I built using those was a nightmare, because chances are along the way, one or two of them would dislodge.
Totally. And then you're like, what's going on? And you're like, or every time you want to work on it, like you fix one thing and you pull out 4 other connectors and you, those things drive me crazy.
I do get I do understand now, having done it with the wrong kind of patch bay, why they're designed that way.
Something else that came out over the last month was Rode Microphones bought a company called Fuzz Measure. I sent the link to you, George, to have a look at. Maybe
so
you
it's
could explain.
It's like a cop detector.
That would be good. No, it just tells you how big they are.
Yeah, well, I've taken a good look at Fuzz Measure. I haven't demoed it yet. I have to dust off my Omni mic. What this is a software for measuring a room acoustically, and it's for helping measure the response of the room and impulse response of the room, how reverberant it is, how echoey it is, how resonant it is.
Does it come up with inverse filters to sort of flatten out the room? Is it like a monitoring system, or is it just a measurement and that's it?
From what I can tell, it's just a measurement tool at this point. It'd be awesome, though, if it did have the ability to output a curve, that you could load into your DAW's 31 band, and then it would
put
just
an IIR curve, an infinite impulse response, and kind of.
Yeah, don't know. don't know. This is something that's really new to me. I mean, I was just introduced to it by Andrew recently. I have a Omni mic, but I do have one of those measurement style omnidirectional mics. It's kind of like a pencil.
Yeah, I got TK30s, and
mine's made by Behringer.
I do actually have the B&Ks. Those are crazy. That don't run off phantom. They run off of 192 volts. Those things will pick up a mouse farting.
Yeah, but I'll give it a shot. Hopefully soon in a studio that's getting finished up right now with very unusually shaped rooms. Mainly because we're taking a 2-car garage and slicing it into 3 rooms, all triangular in size, triangular and basically triangular floor plans, or something somewhat triangular. So
what, you're like throwing a wall down the diagonal and then another half wall down one of the other diagonals?
Sort of. Yeah, the floor plan is nuts. So from an acoustical standpoint, it's going to be complete chaos.
Yeah.
As to what we can do with these rooms. So it's going to be a good test for tools like this. I think at the end of the day, if we can get it to sound good in one spot for the monitoring or for listening, and in the other room have it sound good in one spot for the microphone, we'll be in good shape.
That'll be a win. Absolutely.
Yeah, that'll be a win.
For any small room, that's what you often end up with. And even most every room, it changes where you are, and you tune it for a spot. You can't tune the whole room.
No, especially when there's no symmetry to the room at all.
Right.
None of the rooms have anything symmetrical. So it's going to be very challenging. So it could be a good test for a tool like this. So I'm looking forward to giving this a test, this fuzz measure.
You're going to have to report back.
So does Rode give you the mic, or is it just the software tool?
My understanding
is
they're working on the mic. This is just, you're buying their software, which they in turn bought from somebody else. I think they've rebranded it, but the eventuality is they will then sell it with a package with a calibrated mic.
How is it different than like other, measurement systems? And that,
I don't know it differentiates it from others. Having not used a lot of others, I really made very little use of these tools over the years because my job of doing a voiceover studio is extremely simplistic compared to doing a music studio. So I just get it sounding really good in like one good spot where the mic goes and they're happy. I can do that by ear. But I haven't used the competing tools. But it says Rode test microphones, interfaces, software, and kits are in development and will be released later in 2018. So right now it's just software. It's just an idea.
I'm sure they're going to build other features on it, inverse EQs and things like that.
Sure.
So what's the ideal shape of a room to record in?
A sphere.
I only laugh because that's like saying what's the best mic for voiceover.
Is there one?
Yeah,
that's right.
Probably even harder, actually.
The ideal room is infinitely large and has no hard surfaces anywhere. A field with no birds and no wind and nothing. Yes.
So you're saying an ideal room is a room with no acoustical property of any kind at all. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, because then your voice goes out and never bounces back, and then you've solved all the acoustic problems because there is no acoustics. You just have you and your mic.
Right,
That's an anechoic chamber.
It is.
It's what an anechoic chamber tries to be.
Yeah.
Right.
It approximates very closely.
Right.
I wouldn't want to be in one of those working.
I could sidebar all day or tangent all day, but I heard that the test facilities that Apple developed to build their new HomePod speaker is mind-boggling. They built rooms in underground at the new facility, many rooms whose job it was specifically to design this one product. Multiple anechoic chambers, multiple listening spaces, just to develop that one speaker. I am not in the Apple ecosystem. And that's the problem with these tools, these things. It only speaks Apple stuff. Doesn't work with any Android phones, doesn't work with Spotify. It's dead to me. But acoustically, as a speaker, what it's accomplished is absolutely mind-boggling, what this speaker can do. It's really amazing. Check it out online.
Yeah, I have to check it out. I've been wanting to also check out the anechoic chamber over here at Shure, because Shure's over here in Chicago, and it'd be
field trip.
I've never been in one. Yeah, exactly. If you're listening, Shure, invite me.
Yeah, anechoic chambers can send you completely mad very quickly.
Yeah, like 30 or 40 minutes.
Yeah, everyone finds out that their ears ring. Their ears ring and they don't even know it.
Yeah. You hear ringing, it actually gets to the point where you hear your
the blood flowing
traveling through your body.
Yep.
Yeah, I read that
body.
somewhere. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That'd be weird, wouldn't it?
And then if
freaky.
you like suspend somebody in water that's the right temperature, all of a sudden you have like no sensory input and you flip out.
Right.
I think a cat in an anechoic chamber will die really quickly.
Really?
Because they're so sensory. A bat, that would just...
It would be
that'd dead.
hilarious to see a bat fly into
that'd
the
be weird,
walls or
wouldn't it?
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, we go like sending out signals going, well, I'm in a place that doesn't exist. What the hell's going on?
Yeah.
No animals were harmed in the creation of this podcast.
Except
And
for the
we
cat
all
and the
love
bat.
cats. Yeah.
Correct. Exactly.
Can't really put a dolphin in an anechoic chamber.
Okay, stop it.
Yeah.
In the perfect temperature water
How about a horse?
with a blindfold.
Pony, guinea pig, tortoise.
This is Harlan Hogan on the Pro Audio Suite, or as we say in South America, this is Harlan Hogan on the Pro Audio Suite.
All right, so we've worked out the anechoic chamber. Robert, we're going to have a question for you after this interview. This is part one of an interview Robbo and I did earlier in the week, one we prepared earlier, with Christopher Kent, who you may know as the voice of many British products in America. And in the UK, of course, he's very well known. He also has a studio in Ealing, but we'll talk about that later. Christopher Kent.
It's 0 degrees here at the moment.
Oh, really? It's 29 degrees Celsius here and sunny.
Yeah.
How about you, Robbo?
Yeah,
How's
enjoy
the
that.
temperature up there in Sydney?
I think it's about 38 degrees, something like that. Yeah.
38, yeah. How's the pool? Is the pool nice?
The pool's fantastic. The pool's awesome.
Excellent.
Pools, beaches, it's... well, we dream about these things.
Yeah.
Even in the summer, we don't really get that, but...
Anyway.
I hope you're enjoying it.
Well, I must admit, though, the last summer I had in England, I spent some time in the West Country, and it was perfect. 7 days, 27 degrees.
Yes, it does happen from time to time, yeah. That's why we all sort of walk around with our mouths open in disbelief.
That's right. There was a bit of that going on. Yes.
Well, what happens is you get 1 day of that, and everybody, all the builders take their shirts off, and everyone walks around saying, "Oh, isn't it gorgeous?" And on the second day, all the builders are sunburnt and they're red as lobsters, and everyone's going, "It's too hot. It's too hot. It's not good for the gardens." And so that's the way we carry on.
Yeah, I love that when everyone takes their shirt off down in the Serpentine, and they have that sort of like vest kind of pattern, the white where the vest has been, and they've actually got a bit of a tan going. So it looks like they're still dressed, but they're not. It's very...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. It was puce red arms. It's not really a good look, is it?
No, it's not. Not a good look at all.
No, I'm going to pull this show back into line here because I'm feeling a bit like the thorn between two roses, the Aussie twang with two surreal voiceovers with English accents around me. I'm sort of feeling a bit left out.
Yes, well, are we both the red rose, or are we a red and a white rose?
Well, there you go.
Well,
you can decide that.
I'm from Yorkshire.
Yeah, you're from Yorkshire, you're white rose. So I'm from down south, so I'd be a red rose, wouldn't I? Well, actually, no, because Yorkshire and Lancashire, wasn't it, the red and the white?
Yeah, it was traditionally
that's
Lancashire,
right.
yeah.
So,
as my grandmother used to say, that the only good thing to come out of Lancashire were road to Yorkshire.
exactly. Now, you, for anyone that doesn't know, because a lot of our audience is not in the UK, it's in America and Australia, you are a big player in the voiceover community, but there's a twist in your career, which we'll get to soon, but it's got to do with your studio. But the first question I wanted to get underway was, how did you and when did you get into voiceover?
I was an actor. I am an actor. And I, like a lot of actors, in between work or even while I was doing other things, used to get asked to do voiceovers and enjoyed it, but I don't think I ever sort of took it all that seriously. But at that time, this is pre-remote working, pre-ISDN and so on, you had to go to a studio. Except the other thing I discovered was that there was a sort of community of actors and other voice people who travelled on a circuit to different radio stations. So in the days before ISDN, radio stations in the UK, because remember it's geographically a small country, they made all their radio commercials every week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually. Yeah. And so they would book voice talent through the year, so on the Tuesdays and Thursdays on a sort of rota basis. So what you had to do was try and around about sort of October, November, get onto radio station production managers, commercial production managers, and try and get yourself some bookings. And once you'd got yourself a few bookings, you'd kind of work round it, so that, for instance, say I was booked to go to a Radio Air in Leeds and Radio Hallam in Sheffield, which are sort of 50 miles apart. then on that day, I would then ring up some guys in Birmingham, which is on the way, and some guys in Nottingham, and say, I'm just going to be passing at this time, and they'd say, oh, come in and do a couple of scripts. And so that's the way it worked. We all clocked up hundreds of thousands of miles a year doing these sort of journeys, and sometimes it worked out well, and sometimes you get to the day and they go, well, I haven't really got anything for you. But within a 6-month period, really, when ISDN was first introduced, they started saying, are you getting ISDN? And those of us who weren't of a technical mind at the time would say, what do you mean? And then within 6 months, they'd be saying, well, unless you have an ISDN, we can't work with you because that's what we're going to do. And so for me, it was a combination of that and the fact that I was working in the West End at the time doing a show, and it was all going terribly well. And we bought a house in West London, which is a very expensive place to live, sort of naively, and finished the show in the West End. And my agent said, well, we sit tight, and there were things coming in from the RSC and the National and so on. And she's saying, no, they're not good enough. And I didn't work for 9 months with this huge mortgage in West London. Ouch. At which point I thought I'd better take this voiceover business a bit more seriously. And that was when I started really kind of getting involved, and I installed one of the first home studios that there were over here. I mean, initially there were only sort of 20 or 30 of us doing it, and I knew absolutely nothing, but I got an ISDN line, and that's really, really how it kicked off. But also getting with a really good agent in London. At the time, there were only a few of them, and there were a small community of very, very good voice actors who, even sort of pre-mobile phones, they used to, they actually owned a flat in Soho. Anyone who's worked in the studio scene in London knows that it's all concentrated in an area not much bigger than a parking lot in LA, really. There's just this complete concentration of small, high-end studios and advertising agencies. And so these guys actually bought a flat, an apartment in the middle of Soho, and just used to sit there with their pagers at the time. And, they'd get something saying, dog food at Silk Sound at 2:00, and off they'd go and do that. And then they'd trot off somewhere else, and they were making a great deal of money. So it was an attractive thing to try and work towards, really, at the time.
Yeah, so what year are we talking about?
So that would be the early 90s. So I think ISDN, I set my first studio up in 95 or 6, I think. So that was just the kind of cusp. I mean, the 80s there were a small number of people who made huge amounts of money in voiceover here then, because at the time there were only 4 or latterly 5 TV channels. It seems incredible now, doesn't it?
It does.
And so if you got a campaign, it was playing to 15, 20 million. In our market is big, and your residuals, your repeat fees meant that people were really buying houses and racehorses and all sorts of stuff off the back of it. So there was a small number of people doing a great amount of work, but in the following 20 or 30 years, of course, there's been a sort of an explosion of the number of outlets, both in terms of TV channels themselves, but also online marketing and everything else. So the advertising dollar or pound is spread much more thinly.
Yeah,
I'm interested to hear. Did you hear, you were obviously welcomed into the voiceover community, but did you hit any resistance the opposite way with your acting career? Because and the reason I ask is my ex-wife trained as an actor. And then fell into voiceovers in a big way. She was, for a long time, she was probably one of the busiest sort of female voiceover actors in Sydney. And at the peak of her career, she bumped into one of, just as we started dating actually, she bumped into one of her old teachers from acting school, who sort of went, "Oh, darling, how are you, blah, blah, blah. By the way, what are you doing?" And Jenny sort of said, "Well, I'm doing voiceovers, blah, blah, blah." And she went, hand over the head, the big actress sort of, "Oh my God, you're doing voiceovers. Don't worry, darling, real work will come along soon," and all that sort of stuff. I was like, okay, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I definitely, less so now, but then, certainly going back to the period I'm talking about, the early 90s, it was, I think, truthfully, something a lot of actors wanted to do, but they pretended that they didn't because they knew it was difficult to get into. And so there was a sort of, and certainly well-known actors wouldn't admit to doing it, although a lot of them did do it. It was almost like a sort of, a little bit of a sort of dirty secret. And I think there probably still is slightly a sort of slight resistance or mistrust of people who specialise in it. And I mean, for me, I always intended to carry on as an actor, but in fact, at the time, the nature of it went on so quickly once ISDN was in the house and so on. It became like opening a shop in the morning, really. You know, there were very few of us, and at the time everything came through on faxes, you know, and it was almost the biggest problem was buying enough fax paper. It just, you know, it exploded very, very quickly. And so, you know, 20-something years later, I'm just beginning to get back on stage and do stuff because it's sort of, you know, while I was bringing up a family and so on, it served me very well. But with actors, I mean, yeah, when I talk to young actors now, I sometimes asked to go to, you know, talk to drama students and so on. And the thing you have to say is, it is a serious business. It's not there are no free lunches in it. Nobody's waiting for you to walk through the door. There's a lot of hugely able and hugely qualified people doing it. So you have to take it seriously. And the thing I do with them is I give them the worst piece of advertising copy I can lay my hands on at any given time, which, as most of us know, isn't that hard. So, you know, a really terrible sort of 30-second carpet warehouse ad or, you know, second-hand car deal or something like that. Yeah. And I ask them to read it, and most of them find it very difficult to do it seriously with conviction. They tend to want to sort of send it up. And then I give them a Shakespeare sonnet and say, read that. And they, of course, they're training as actors. They like to think they can do that. And then I say, but they're very similar, aren't they? Because in both cases, you've got a premise and an antithesis, and that's worked through. And then you have a closing couplet, which sums up what's being said. And you have to apply the same disciplines to it. You have to have as much conviction about the terrible 30-second advert as you do about the wonderful Shakespeare sonnet. And that's what people are buying. They're buying your ability to technically and emotionally and in human terms communicate some sense of language in a convincing way to people. So, you know, whenever you do get a kind of a snobbishness, if you want to call it that, from actors about it, that's the way I always turn it round to them and say, you know, it's the same skill set and it's not easy to do. So, you know, it's worth taking seriously.
It's interesting you should say that. I heard I'll paraphrase a quote I heard the other day, the difference between an actor and a voice actor. An actor is given a script and a backstory of a character. They learn the character, they learn the story, they learn the script. They get to meet their other characters in that piece. They either go on stage with that piece or they go on film with that piece. But they're now performing to an audience that wants to see them act and they want to see this thing. The difference is with voiceover is you're given a script you've never seen before. You have no backstory. You don't understand the story, so you've got to quickly analyse the story. And then your finished work will be met by a hostile audience because no one wants to hear ads.
Yeah.
So you've got to make that ad work. You know.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got to be that much more convincing. I think that's a really interesting analogy, actually, isn't it?
Yeah. So your first studio was obviously with ISDN back in the 90s, and you had your mates living in Soho in a flat, which I think is a sitcom. It's almost like Toast of London.
It's a show about nothing.
Yeah. No, Toast of London, I'm sure, is a documentary. But anyway, we'll get into that one. For anyone that hasn't seen it, check that out. But what was the instigator for you to set up what is now CKUK?
A couple of things really was when we had young children. I find they're not really understanding of studio discipline. I don't know, you know, when you say, "Could you be quiet?" and they go, "Oh yeah," and then they thunder about the place, you know. And this is so there was a kind of inbuilt stress because it was quite a small house. And what we did when I first installed the ISDN studio, I mean, you know, going back then, it never occurred to anyone that we would end up recording ourselves and, you know, computer recording and so on. It was just an ISDN codec and a small mixing desk and a mic. And, you know, I asked in the friendly studios I went in what I should have, and that's how I worked it out. And but it was what would have been the downstairs WC in the house. Yeah. I mean, my wife used to say, you know, you go in there and crap comes out of both ends. And but except it didn't function as that. It was just a studio. So it was a small booth, but it meant that you know, as time went on, and you know, sometimes clients would want to come in, and Fenella would just have to take the kids out and walk around until I'd finished and come back. And it was obviously that was creating a certain amount of domestic strain. So we just happened to walk past this building, which is a couple of streets away. People who know London. It's, lots of houses rammed together in these residential areas, and a couple of streets away there was this detached building, which, I don't know, couldn't quite work out what it was, whether it was a business or a home, and then it became on the market. And this is a measure of how financial circumstances have changed and how banks' behaviour has changed, because I just went to our bank and said, I want to buy this building. And they went, that's fine, yeah, we'll lend you 2/3 of the money. And then I had to raise the rest somehow. And but then, obviously, once we had a building, we had to think of something to put in it, which was more than just me. And interesting, I found that in the very early days, I mean, this, going back sort of 94, 5 or something, people started to build websites, but at the time it was very difficult to put audio on a website. There used to be something called a real audio player, and it's all a bit clunky. And I'd, round about that time, met and started working with a brilliant voice coach in the US called Maurice Tobias, who not only was very good at, for me, concentrating my mind on what I was doing, because when we first met, she said, well, you're very good at it, but you don't take it seriously. You think you're just waiting for the next acting job to come along, which was absolutely true. And she helped me sort of think in terms of what I needed to do to make it a viable business in its own right. And one of the things, when I, eventually said, well, let's work together on this, and I flew to LA, and she put a demo together for me and started putting together a marketing idea. And that's where the CKUK thing came from. We sat at Jerry's Daily in West Hollywood, I think, and she produced this bit of paper that said CKUK Designer Reads, and it was sort of based on the DKNY and Calvin Klein branding. And she said, you have to bring forward your own personality and make that your business. And I then came home and thought, well, I'm sure I won't be able to get the domain ckuk.com. Surely someone will own that already. But they didn't, and so I got it. And I thought, I need to create a website. But everybody else at that time, insofar as there were voiceover websites, they tended to be a picture of a guy with a microphone and or a picture of a microphone, and these rather sort of clunky audio demos and so on. And so I thought, well, maybe a different way to do this is to try and sort of pull on the branding side of it a little bit. So I hunted around and put out to tender, really, the idea of this website to fashion designers, and found a young Australian guy actually called Richard Denise, who was working in London at the time, who'd done a lot of fashion work, and he kind of latched onto it and came up with really good ideas and produced this fashion sort of, it was a slightly sort of spoof thing, but it was sort of shots of me as, kind of carry a bag with CKUK over my shoulder, and quite funny in a way. But also he said, the way to put audio on this website is to use Flash, which at the time was a relatively new thing. And he created this Flash-based website that had integral audio in it, which is a long answer to your question, because what happened when I launched that website, it did very well for me as in terms of my voiceover business, but I also found that people were getting in touch saying, I just saw your website. Could you get me this done in French, German, and Italian? And could we book so and so? And somehow the strength of the brand made them think it was some kind of agency, really, which it wasn't. Initially, I thought, well, that's not what I'm advertising. And then I thought, well, if they think I can do it, they seem to think I'm sure I can, And I happen to know a very good French voiceover in London who had a small agency, still doing it, Daniel Pajon and Actors World Productions in London, and he knew just about everybody who'd ever worked for the BBC World Service. And so we started doing that, and quite often if I was doing a big campaign for Volvo or someone like that, they'd say, can you get this done in this other list of languages? And so we started facilitating that. So that was the other thing. We moved into the building. So that's what CKUK Media Limited, CKUK Spoken Words became, was 1/3 me, 1/3 the multilingual production service, and the other third was the studio itself, because we thought we needed to make it like a West End production facility. But at the time when I was going into studios in Soho, and digital audio was still quite a new thing, and they were all film-based, really. So what happened was, when you were sitting there and somebody just wanted an audio file for their website or their their corporate program or whatever, it took about 3 people running up and down a corridor to transfer it from whatever format they were recording it on into a digital format so this person could take it away with them. The studios just weren't set up like that. So what I thought was we could create a studio that had all of their production values, but didn't have the bits that people didn't want. So I think we were one of the first kind of purely digital-based voiceover recording studios. And that's what we concentrated on, just trying to make the best sound we could and making it easy for people to take away with them. And, we had an FTP site, which at the time was sort of white-hot technology, where we could transfer audio to people. Now we just all take all this stuff for granted, and we transfer and send stuff about to each other. But at the time, it was, that people used couriers to take audio. It was put onto objects, onto tapes or CDs or whatever, and it was taken between people in that way, and it was quite unusual to say, you don't need any of that, we'll just transfer it to you in what we now call the cloud. And that was really the sort of starting point for the studio, and so it went on from there.
Did you find anyone becoming hostile about the fact that you, being a voice talent, had a setup like that?
Yeah, not hostile, not to me anyway, but there was a certain understandable resistance, because studios would say they can't possibly know what they're doing because they're artists. But I mean, I was quite careful to involve technical advice, and in less so now, but I would. I used to hire engineers in to do stuff. I didn't sort of pretend that I knew. And I find generally, if I was working in a studio, I wouldn't ever want to sort of steal people's ideas, and certainly not their clients, but I would stay behind if the engineer was somebody who was friendly and willing to talk, and just ask some questions and say, when you're recording that, and when we got to that point, why did you do that? And what was that bit of processing used? And I really love the sound here. What is it exactly you're using? And just sort of built up knowledge like that. But I think there certainly would have been a degree of resistance. But curiously, the strange thing was as well that in some senses we did actually know more than some studios because of the ISDN thing. We all got up to speed very quickly on how to connect via ISDN and what being framed meant, and what being in independent mode meant, and all these kinds of different things. And whereas some of the London studios, they had these bits of kit, but they did use them very rarely. So sometimes you'd be sitting in a session in a London studio doing an ISDN with someone in another country, and they were completely at a loss as to what was happening, and you had to find the right way of saying, actually, if you try this, I think you might find it works. And it's not, there's a subtle politics involved there. But I mean, by and large, I wouldn't ever, studio engineers are brilliant people who have fantastic amounts of knowledge, and I wouldn't ever claim to, be able to do their job. I would always hire in somebody who was a specialist in it. But what I felt I could bring to it was my understanding of being on the other side of the glass, because sometimes you can work in brilliant studios where it's not particularly comfortable to work in as a talent. Somehow the ergonomics of it or whatever aren't right. And I always felt as well that the way to produce something successfully was to make it an inclusive project, so that everybody in the studio was involved in it, and that you didn't have a sense that the talent was just somebody who was kind of brought in to speak and then left out of it. I mean, I still find it amazing when I'm producing sometimes, and when I'm a voice, that if they don't want to involve the talent in it, like they'll record a take and then put it with the music and say, oh no, it doesn't work. And I'd say, well, we need to let him or her know the music. They're the experts in this field. And so my idea was always to sort of try and get people as relaxed and convivial as possible in the working environment, and then do the recording, and then it happens much more quickly and much more happily as well, because quite often people are, we sometimes had very well-known people in here who are incredibly nervous, and you don't get the best performance out of them. And it's a big, massive name drop, but lovely Judi Dench came here quite a few times, and the first time she came she was very, very nervous about it. And so we all had something to eat and drink and chatted away. And by the time we started it was, it went very well. But that was always my concept, really, was to have a good vibe about the place and make sure everyone was friendly and there wasn't this kind of hierarchical divide between people.
We've all been around this industry long enough to remember the first days of ISDN. I don't know about you guys, but when I remember talking about, linking up and all that sort of stuff, it was so foreign to me. And I can't imagine having to be a voiceover artist in the UK sort of going, oh, shit, I've got to figure this out and I've got to figure it out quickly.
It was in the 90s, right?
Yeah,
So
early 90s, yeah.
most of us wouldn't have had any digital recording technology of any kind. So
No, I
all
didn't.
this terminology would have been new to all of the users for the most part, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
it was like people had digital reverbs, but every piece of digital equipment, including most of these ISDN boxes, had, just analog ins and outs. Everything had its own converters. And so sample rates and, besides your delays and your reverbs, it was probably the only other digital piece of gear in the studios at that time.
Yeah. And also the fact that, you're used to going in and walking into a studio and being handed a script or two and reading them. All of a sudden you're sitting there in a converted toilet trying to work out how to use your ISDN box and not sound like you're in a converted toilet.
Right. So you have the technical issues to deal with, trying to make that space you have available to you sound somewhat decent, like a studio. Two major issues to figure out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was no me to help you.
Exactly.
Well, and it opened up markets. It changed the whole dynamic, of post-production, just from my perspective. And as all these, not just ISDN, but more and more as remote connections came down, now it's all remote. Like no one even bothers to say, oh, I need to save money to, hire a local talent, because now, the connections and everything are in people's home studios. The people hiring talent are not even conditioned anymore to pay for a remote studio. And so there's no motivation to hire locally.
There was an interesting thing. Bo Weaver, who I know George knows, I spoke to him a few years ago now, and he was saying about how he got his home studio going, because it was him and another couple of ex-radio guys who were working, I think, in Boulder or Denver maybe. And it was when the first ad came on TV about FedEx, we guaranteed to get it there overnight. And he just looked at the ad and thought, we can turn this into a business. And they went off, they made some demos and took off to their first, which became Promax, promoted that they could deliver voiceovers the next morning. That was the beginning of the remote studio.
Am I wrong in saying, Robert, you might correct me on this, am I wrong in saying that ISDN was originally created for data as opposed to audio? Is that right?
So ISDN is Integrated Services Digital Network, and it was basically designed in the 70s as the phone system switched from analog, literally analog hard switching, very much like what we were talking about before with that studio patch-based switcher thing. And it went from analog switched to digitally switched, so that they could, or not digitally switched, but digital data going through the phone network, so they could, pass calls more easily, more efficiently using the lines that they had. And so the first thing that came up was if you've heard of it, the G.711 codec. So that was your 8-bit 8K phone call that is now what everyone thinks of when they think of phone quality. Phone quality used to be just because, low bandwidth and long analog lines, but then it got digitized. So after they digitized the phone network, the next obvious thing is, well, what else can we do with it? And their whole idea was, we're going to do video phones. We're going to do data transfers for all kinds of businesses. And this was the thought of how to do, digital communications prior to the internet, which was happening at the same time, but with the military. And it wasn't released, I guess, until, Al Gore gave it to everybody. So what happened on ISDN? Doctors looking at X-ray scans remotely, video conferencing, high quality audio, banking systems, whatever you can do passing data. That's what ISDN was intended for. And it stuck around and worked for a long time, having the advantage of being a point-to-point dedicated connection that's more solid than the internet, because the internet was designed to be faulty and fault tolerant and recover from its faults, whereas ISDN was basically designed not to have faults, more expensive to accomplish that. And the internet kind of took over to the point where we are now, where we're kind of move over ISDN. All the phone companies are saying, we don't want to continue providing this service and find a way to do it over the internet.
We're going to have to change the name of this podcast from the Pro Audio Suite to the History of Audio, with conversations about the history of Neumann and Gefell and where ISDN came from. This wealth of knowledge that's sitting around this table at the moment.
It's almost like we need Stephen Fry. Do you know Stephen Fry in America? I'm sure you do.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But it totally changed the market. You know, it was like, at first it saved money. ISDN saves money. It saves, flights and workflows, and you have to do phone patches and then try to get your stuff FedEx, so things were faster, therefore cheaper. And then it became, when the internet came around, it became actually too expensive because there was, less expensive ways to sort of, accomplish the same workflow.
I remember seeing $16,000, $25,000 ISDN bills rolling into the radio station there at one stage.
Oh, yeah. It was so expensive. Still is.
Still is for the actual phone calls. Yeah, the minute by minute charges. And then, I don't know what's happening in AT&T, or in Australia, but AT&T in the United States is really charging an arm and a leg for their services, for their ISDN services, because they're basically trying to get everyone to get rid of their lines. So it still is. It's actually getting more expensive.
Yeah, they're charging an arm and a leg because they want to get ahead.
Right.
Good one, man.
Well, it sort of it leads us kind of nicely to our next little piece, which was a question for Robert regarding a session. Actually, Andrew and I were on the other day, and it's a bit of a tech question about Source Connect Now. You might be able to answer for us. We were recording an interview, and the talent we were talking to was recording on his end on Source Connect Now. Logged out, forgot to download his recording before logging out, logged back in. Is there any way we can rescue that, Robert?
Unfortunately not, because Source Connect Now is based on a web browser in Chrome. Web browsers have what's called the sandbox, which keeps a page from getting into your file system. It's a security thing. And so you have to actively download that. And if not, it's in the cache of that particular page. And once you leave that page, the browser clears that cache and it is lost. That is, we're looking at improving all the capabilities of Source Connect Now to sort of round it out with more recording capability than only your input, for example. And I'm hoping that there's a solution or a better workflow for the sandbox nature of web browsers.
Well, I reckon that's pretty good for the first episode of the Pro Audio Suite. What do you reckon, chaps?
I think it was very well done, boys.
We'll be back next week. We're talking studio monitors for your home studio. We're talking something that's gone from the charts, but maybe not from our hearts, virtual glass. And also, I want to find out more about isolating your booth with what sort of door you should use.
Yeah,
and plenty of other stuff.
I think there's something about peeing here too, because it just says sit or stand.
That's right.
That'll
be next week.
We're going to talk about sitting and standing.
Yes. All right, on that note, I think we should slam the door on another Pro Audio Suite.
Goodbye, goodbye. Wipe the tear, baby, from your eye. Though it's hard to part, I know. I'll be tickled to death to go. Don't cry, don't sigh. There's a silver lining in the sky. Bonsoir, old thing, cheerio, chin chin, na poo toodaloo, goodbye.